Rome was not built in a day, but if you lived there during the time it was being built, you might have wished it would be because living conditions were just that bad. Behind all the amazing architecture, the beautiful statues, and the incredible artwork, the city stank, like really, really bad. And it's easy to assume that the stench of rotting food, stale urine, and human excrement would only come from the trash and sewage. But no, the citizens of Rome had little regard for their personal hygiene. They didn't use soap and rarely bathed, and they used the same cloth for everything, including wiping themselves after going to the bathroom. And since everyone shared these cloths, things got pretty smelly fast. The streets of ancient Rome were also dirty. Most of them were unpaved, which meant they were covered in a layer of dirt and dust, especially after a rainstorm when the mud would get kicked up from carts and other vehicles. To make matters worse, most streets were incredibly narrow, so it was nearly impossible to avoid running into someone else or something else coming your way. If you wanted to walk down the middle of the street to avoid running into pedestrians, well, you wouldn't have been able to even if you wanted to, because chariot drivers didn't care where they drove. Charioteers would yell ahead as they approached so you'd know to move, but at least one person per day probably didn't hear them coming. And instead of dodging the chariot, they'd jump out of the way, usually right into the path of another chariot. In a perfect world, the charioteers would slow down and help the poor guy who just jumped out of the way, but this wasn't the case. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The charioteers would whip their horses and yell even more, making the situation even more dangerous for the pedestrian, who'd then have to dodge horses' hind legs while trying to find some space on the side of the street. If that didn't sound chaotic enough, just think about how much noise there must have been. Carts, chariots, vendors, angry drivers, loud animals, screaming children, and milling crowds made the streets deafening. Even if you could handle all that noise, imagine what it must have smelled like. Animal dung, stale waste, sweat, and garbage were just some of the odors that plagued the streets of ancient Rome. On top of that, it was extremely common for shopkeepers to throw their trash out the window onto the street below, meaning you could be walking along minding your own business and suddenly find a dead mouse or some other piece of garbage land on your head. Even worse than that, though, was if you happened to be an animal, whether it was a dog, a cat, an ox, or a pig. For the average Roman citizen, wild animals in the city were a nuisance. Stray dogs would scavenge for food in the garbage and then chase each other through the streets. These dogs would usually stay away from humans. However, if you were poor, you might have had a dog because they were excellent for keeping rats away. Plus, they can eat garbage, so they saved you money on food. As you can see, there were many benefits to having a dog, but that didn't mean the citizens of Rome appreciated them. Wild animals often went unfed, so they'd bite people just out of desperation. When they did attack, they weren't always small dogs either. Hungry wolves, bears, and even poisonous snakes would sometimes show up in the city. Most of these wild animals were killed, but there were always more that took their place. Not only were there wild animals, but domestic ones too. Some people owned pigs, which were great because they'd go around eating garbage. This saved the owners money and kept the streets clean. Well, sort of. The problem was, pigs are stubborn and can be incredibly aggressive when they don't want to move. They'd often get stuck in doorways, blocking passage and growling at anyone who tried to get by. It's unlikely that a pig would actually bite someone, but they certainly could have scratched you badly if you annoyed them long enough. That doesn't mean the Romans didn't love their pigs, though. They were a source of food, so the farmers took pride in their animals. Pigs were given names, and some were even taught to do tricks. Still, pigs weren't the favorite domestic animal in Rome. The honor belonged to the dog. Dogs were seen as loyal and brave, and they were often used to hunt other animals. Dogs also helped guard homes and property, and unlike cats, they enjoyed playing fetch. Romans loved it when dogs chased after their chariots as they rode through the streets. Since dogs were popular, wealthy Romans even entered them into competitions, such as the National Dog Show held every year in the Circus Maximus. While the competition was fierce, there was one event that no dog wanted to participate in: the fight to the death. Yes, you heard that right. In ancient Rome, dog fighting was a thing. Now, we don't know exactly how this blood sport evolved, but it likely started out as a way for dog owners to train their pets to protect them while traveling. Fighting other dogs is a surefire way to make your dog aggressive and prepared for anything. Soon, though, it turned into a spectator sport, and people would pay admission for the dog shows by bringing a dog and then pitting them against another dog for the crowd's enjoyment. It's hard to watch dog fights today and not feel sick to your stomach. So imagine what it must have been like in ancient Rome. While watching dogs fight to the death was entertaining for some, others would rather watch the gladiators battle it out in the Colosseum. It was free entertainment, so it attracted large crowds. During the gladiator games, two men would enter the arena, each armed with a sword and shield. They'd fight until one of them died or couldn't continue. The games were brutal, bloody, and exciting. There was nothing better than watching a gladiator lose his hand or get stabbed through the chest. Of course, these fights were fake, but the injuries were real. Men would enter the Colosseum, and sometimes they never leave. But why were gladiators fighting? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, in some cases, it was simply to win the crowd over. Gladiators were ranked, and the higher the rank, the more privileges they received. Their weapons were sharper, their armor was better, and they were given bigger and scarier opponents. Spectators knew the outcome of the fight before it began, and the losers were humiliated as they exited the Colosseum. Sometimes the fights were between two groups of gladiators, with one group being instructed to kill the other. This was good practice for real combat, since Rome had conquered much of the Mediterranean by the time the Colosseum was built. The military was constantly expanding, and they needed new recruits to fill the ranks. That's why there were special events in the Colosseum called mock battles, where two teams of gladiators would go head-to-head. The mock battles were meant to simulate a real battle as closely as possible. The idea was to let the soldiers hone their skills in a safe environment. There was still a lot of blood spilled in the Colosseum, but the goal was to come out victorious without anyone dying. However, not all of the combat in the Colosseum was fake. Sometimes criminals were sentenced to fight to the death. The Emperor Nero hosted events where he invited condemned men and gave them a choice. They could either fight a gladiator, an animal, or another criminal. If they won, they were set free. If they lost, they were executed. On another occasion, Nero ordered 6 of the most ruthless gladiators to be brought into the Senate. He then told the audience that these men were senators who opposed him and told them to kill the gladiators. The audience watched in horror as the men were torn apart. Even if you could ignore the sounds of combat, the sight of a decomposing body lying in the street was enough to ruin your appetite. You might have thought twice about eating after seeing the execution of criminals, but that wasn't the worst thing you could witness. Some criminals were put on display after their execution, and the Romans would parade them around the city on a cart, showing off their mutilated bodies to everyone they passed. One wrong turn, and you could find yourself face to face with a dead man's head. Other times, the public executions were for entertainment. Criminals could be crucified, burned alive, or sewn up in a leather bag with venomous snakes. These sights were meant to scare the public into staying away from crime. It worked, too. It's unlikely that anyone considering committing a crime would see a man getting skinned alive and think, you know what, that looks fun, as if that wasn't gross enough. Sometimes the criminals were forced to drink wine mixed with the ashes of their family members, no matter how bad the punishment seemed, though it could always get worse. A person convicted of poisoning someone would be killed by that same poison. The Romans believed that if the poison was in their veins, it would stop hurting them eventually. But this wasn't always true, and some condemned men suffered for days as they waited for the poison to kill them. Click here to watch one of these next videos and let us know in the comments section if you think you could survive the streets of ancient Rome, or click here to watch this video instead.